We are joined by repeat guest Jim Carafano, national security and foreign policy expert and vice president of the Heritage Foundation, online at heritage.org. And Jim, thank you for being with us tonight.
Hey, great to be with you.
Wanted to talk a little bit about just what China has or has not done as regards this virus and motivations behind that. First of all, from your perspective, the charges that the Chinese did not do what they were really obligated to do as a civilized nation, are those charges fair? The Chinese, of course, vehemently deny it.
Well, I think there's two legitimate criticisms, and we can argue about the motivation, whether these were acts of omission or commission or whatever, but there's clearly two things they did that precipitated triggering the virus, and I think they are literally factual and indisputable. One is that the Chinese knew that the disease was highly communicable. They knew that there were many tens of thousands of people that had come back to China for the Chinese New Year's that were going to leave, could well be infected, and they knew that this would be very dangerous, particularly for vulnerable populations. And they let those people leave the country without kind of any warning or anything else. So we know that for a fact. That contributed to the outbreaks in places like Italy and New York City. That's just not disputable because you just follow the genetic trail of the virus. The other issue is after SARS, outbreak about a decade before, there was a revision to the international health regulations, which all members of the WHO, World Health Organization, including China, agree to, and there are very specific requirements for pandemic reporting. China missed those. They didn't miss them by hours or days, depending upon whose timeline you look at. They missed it by weeks or maybe even months, and that is time that if China had fully complied with the reporting requirements, that other countries would have had information that they needed in order to prepare for the pandemic and maybe had been able to stop outbreaks in their own countries. One of the reporting requirements the Chinese still haven't complied with, which is to provide original live versions of the original strain of the virus, which is important for vaccine development, for kind of tracking the virus and how it's changing, for therapeutics and other strategies. So, people can debate the origins of the virus and everything else, but those facts are indisputable, and both those failures contributed to triggering the global pandemic.
And if you look at what, therefore, we see regarding the Chinese, this was going to come out, and it was going to make the Chinese look incompetent at best and malevolent at worst. And for the life of me, I don't see how the Chinese ignored that. Ignore whatever their motivations are towards foreign policy and the like. I certainly don't believe that their motivation was to severely cripple their own economy and turn the entire world against them, including portions of the world which heretofore had been more or less tolerant of the Chinese, for example, breaking every agreement they ever signed. For the life of me, I cannot understand why the Chinese would have gone down this path.
Well, there are a number of explanations, all of which are plausible in the sense of how the Chinese government works and operates, which we have a fairly good understanding to. I have a tremendous analyst at Heritage, Dean Chang, who reads much of their literature in the original Chinese and probably one of the foremost thinker on political military thinking in China. So there's a couple of things that would explain this. One, of course, is the nature of these authoritarian regimes in which people tend to be very risk averse and in which are very, very difficult to make decisions at the lower level. So you can certainly see a situation where people are afraid to act and make decisions, and that really delayed the response. So that's one answer, which I think is credible. The other is, and I think this needs to be explored more deeply, is the Chinese can in part be acting out of fear. They're being crippled by the virus, and they could be afraid other people would take advantage of that. So they do nothing. And then as the virus spreads, their culpability becomes even greater, and they're afraid of their reputation, and so they do nothing. And so when you look at the Chinese response now, which has actually been quite thuggish, I mean, and very, in a sense, unusual, even for the Chinese, overtly being incredibly aggressive about this, not only spreading disinformation, trying to blame other countries, but incredible denials of basic facts. and then pressuring other countries. I mean, threatening them, Australia, New Zealand, other countries, or selling or refusing to sell medical equipment to a country unless the country publicly thanks China for helping them. I mean, I get a sense that this is not the inscrutable Chinese 1,000-year thinking, that these are guys who have lost control of the global narrative, of their own brand, and they're just literally throwing spaghetti at the wall because they've never faced anything like this before. They've never faced the international scrutiny like this before, and they're just panicking, trying to figure out how to deal with it.
Wow. So, in other words, the first of my two alternatives, incompetent. That's I find that remarkable. I would have accused the Chinese of many things, but I think that kind of gross incompetence I wouldn't have. And maybe we people like me, lay people who look at this, but not as deeply as analysts like you do and others. Maybe we look at the Chinese experimenting with free enterprise, at wearing of business suits, and we see all of the modern skyscrapers in Shanghai and the cars dotting the streets, and we think, gee, they're becoming just like us. Maybe we have been sort of walking down the wrong path in that regard.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, for literally, I think probably since the 90s, we've been having this debate as China rose that don't worry about it. China would rise. They would become more like us. They'd become invested in the international system. They'd be a net contributor. And the converse of that is, no, you don't understand. The Chinese society government is fundamentally different than we. I mean, fundamentally, for all our disagreements, like Trump, hate Trump, pro-France, anti-German, it doesn't matter. There's still a free world, and the one thing in common that all those countries have is they believe fundamentally in human rights, they believe in popular sovereignty, and they believe in the free enterprise system with all its imperfections. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't believe in any of those things. That it took really, I think, decades, but it's only really in the last, I think, 5-6 years that people have realized that no, as China rises, what's happening is the Communist Party is gaining more power, and they are using that power to further the interests of the Communist Party. So the people they're arguing as China rose, it would become more dangerous because it is rooted in the control of the Communist Party system. They were right. And I think, if anything, if there's a good side to this crisis, which I can't imagine you could argue that, but it has shown that the Chinese Communist Party for what they are. This is a thuggish regime which only cares about itself, and left to its own devices, unchecked, unchallenged in the world, they will destroy the free world. They're going to melt us into the ground, but they see everything that we truly root our society in as an obstacle to the expansion of their power, and they will do what they can to undermine that because they fundamentally see that is in their interest.